2 Samuel chapter 1, page 427. After the death of Saul, David returned from striking down the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the third day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honour. "Where have you come from?" David asked. He answered, "I have escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." "The men fled from the battle," he replied. "Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man said, "and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots and their drivers in hot pursuit. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then he said to me, 'Stand here by me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and have brought them here to my lord." Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who brought him the report, "Where are you from?" "I am the son of a foreigner, an Amalekite," he answered. David asked him, "Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of his men and said, "Go strike him down." So he struck him down, and he died. For David had said to him, "Your blood be on your own head, for your mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, and he ordered that the people of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jasar. "A gazelle lies slain on your heights, Israel. How the mighty have failed. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not to the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. Mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain. May no shower fall on your terraced fields. For there the shield of the mighty was despised, the shield of Saul no longer rubbed with oil. Then the blood of the slain from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks, Jeanette. Morning, all. I want to ask you as we begin, have you ever received a surprising response to something you said? You might have told a story, you might have shared some news, you might have just made a clever comment, and you think you know what's going to happen. You think you know what response you're going to get, how that person's going to receive it. Maybe you're expecting them to laugh or to join with you, agree with you, whatever it might be. But then that person's response to what you've said is the opposite of what you expected. Now, when I was in high school, I used to catch a bus. I'd catch it at Mulgoa Road down in Regentville, where all the road work is happening at the moment. And we'd travel on the bus to Penrith Station. But the bus would stop at Penrith Station to drop off the commuters and pick up students from our school, and then we'd head out to Cranebrook. But because I was one of the last people on the bus, I'd usually end up sitting up the front. And this one day, we pulled up at the station and the bus driver asked me to do him a favour. He put $5 in my hand, and I heard him ask me to get him a paper from the station shop, and so I did. Went to the station shop, bought a paper. And so I came back to the bus with certain expectations. I expected to be welcomed back by this friendly bus driver with a smile, maybe some words of approval, some admiration for my efforts, maybe even a keep the change. But I didn't get any of those things. As I got on, the bus driver groaned at me, took the change, took the paper, put the paper next to the paper that he already had, and responded that what he wanted was a pie. I was devastated. I kept my distance from that driver for a while after that. But in our passage today, we see two surprising responses. We see surprising responses, and both responses, they come from the same person, from David. First, we see David's surprising response to a messenger. And then we see David's surprising response to the message. So first, we'll begin with David's surprising response to this messenger. The scene is set for us in verse 1. After the death of Saul, David returned from striking down the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the third day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. You can imagine this man's arrival then, can't you, as it's described for us. This man staggers down the road. He's covered the 130k journey from the battle lines way up north at Mount Gilboa, all the way down to Ziklag in the south. You can see Mount Gilboa, Ziklag underlined there. That's the journey that he'd undertaken. And as he gets closer, people can see the condition of his clothes. They can see the dust on his head. And the more people see him, the more they can guess the kind of news that he was bringing, that it was bad news. And this messenger comes to David. He falls to the ground to pay him honor. But David doesn't want to guess what the news is. He wants to hear the news for himself. In verse 3, David asks the man, "Where have you come from?" "I've escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened? Tell me," David says. "The men fled from the battle. Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." This is the message. These are the facts of the battle. And the news brought by this man who fled fits with what we know from the end of 1 Samuel. Fits with what we've been told in chapter 31. But David wants to know more from this man, from this messenger. In verse 5, David asks him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And the man tells this story. "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, with the chariots and their drivers in hot pursuit. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then he said to me, 'Stand here by me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.' So," the man says, "I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he'd fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and have brought them here to my Lord." According to the Amalekite messenger, that's what happened. He was asked by Saul to give him a mercy killing, and he obliged. Now, this is an aside, but as readers, we've already heard a different account of Saul's death in 1 Samuel 31. I wonder if you notice some of the differences. The account in 1 Samuel 31 showed us that Saul was near death, and he asked his armor bearer to kill him. But his armor bearer was terrified and wouldn't do it. So Saul fell on his sword. And then the next day we heard that the Philistines came along to strip the bodies, and they found Saul cut off his head, stripped off his armor, and proclaimed the good news of his death. And so how do we make sense then of these two accounts of Saul's death? Well, the detail of who's telling this second story makes all the difference for us as readers, because the account that's told to David is told by an Amalekite. As soon as this messenger mentions that he's an Amalekite, that's meant to change our perspective on what he says. He suddenly goes from being a trustworthy messenger to being untrustworthy. In 1 Samuel and even before that in the Bible, the Amalekites have shown themselves to be untrustworthy, to be sneaky. They're like the hyenas of the animal kingdom. They're sniffing around looking for ways to catch people out, to prey on the weak, to profit from the unsuspecting. And so it's reasonable to think that that's now what the Amalekite was doing with Saul. He saw Saul's death. He was in the area. And he saw an opportunity too good to miss. An opportunity to be seen by the new king as the hero who killed the old king. And so he took the crown, the band from Saul's still warm body, ran as fast as he could to David, the king in waiting, bows before David, offers David the crown and the band, and shares his story, his self-promoting story of Saul's death. But that aside, getting back on track, what would you expect David to do with this messenger? With this message that he brings, with this man who brings the crown and the band? Would you expect David to give this messenger recognition and reward? This messenger had dealt with Saul. He'd personally brought an end to the reign of Saul. He'd opened up the way for David to be king over Israel instead of Saul. He'd brought the crown and the band so David's reign could begin as soon as possible. What a hero! And not only that, but this man has also brought an end to Saul's attempts on David's life. He dealt with Saul, who'd repeatedly tried to kill David, who'd tried to pin David to the wall with his spear, who'd sent David on an impossible mission, hoping he'd die at the hands of the Philistines. Saul, who'd repeatedly gone out into the desert with his whole army, pursuing David to try and put him to death. How should David have responded to this message? Well, humanly speaking, David should have richly rewarded this messenger for what he'd done. But that's not the response that we see. That's not the response the messenger receives. Because David's response to the messenger isn't defined by human expectations. It's informed and transformed by what God has said about his anointed. In verse 14, David asks the messenger, "Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" And then David calls one of his men and said, "Go, strike him down." So he struck him down and he died. For David had said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth has testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" Now, the big question that we're supposed to be asking is, why? Why does David respond to the messenger this way? Well, he doesn't order the death of the Amalekite because the Amalekite lied or because he misrepresented the way Saul died. There's no suggestion of that. David orders his death because David's perspective on Saul wasn't shaped by human expectations. What David thought of Saul, the way that David treated Saul, the way other people needed to treat Saul, was shaped by what God had said about Saul. Because Saul was the man God had anointed and appointed as king over Israel. And this has been David's perspective no matter what Saul has done to him, no matter how much David might have wanted Saul's crown, no matter how wrong David might have felt by Saul, no matter how many opportunities David was given to deal with Saul himself or through others. So that even when David and his men had the opportunity to kill Saul, back in chapter 26, he said, "Don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" So even though the Amalekite presented his actions against Saul as mercy, This is the guilt that the messenger took on, the guilt of killing, laying a hand on the Lord's anointed. He claimed to have killed Saul, even though he knew who Saul was. He claimed to have done fearlessly what he should have been fearful about. Like Saul's armor bearer, he should have been terrified by that order. He should have refused that order. Not out of fear of Saul, but out of fear of God who'd anointed Saul. And it's this mistreatment of Saul by the messenger that David acted on, that David responds to show how serious it was for anyone, for any reason, to lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. And so this is David's surprising response to the messenger, a response that's surprising because it's not shaped by human expectations. It doesn't bring the messenger recognition or reward. It's a response that shows how seriously David takes what God has said, and specifically what God has said about Saul. It shows how much David cares about how Saul is treated, how even a dying Saul is treated, because Saul is still the Lord's anointed. That's our first point. And our second is like it, as we see a second surprising response. David's surprising response to the message of Saul's death. Excuse me. Now, if you've been to a few funerals, then you'll know that someone's death often gives an opportunity for clarity, an opportunity for friends and family to genuinely reflect on the whole of that person's life. And some people have the privilege of sharing those reflections in a eulogy. I remember taking a funeral here a couple of years ago. During the service, a couple of family members got up, shared eulogies, shared stories of that person's life. And in the sermon, I shared a little bit of my experience with that person during the sermon. But as the service ended and we went out and I was shaking hands at the door, another family member took me aside. And they told me that the person being remembered was nothing like what we'd heard. And they shared at length some of the trouble this person had caused. Now, I imagine for each of us, there are people who we'd choose to do our eulogy. And there's probably also people who we'd be less likely to choose if we could. And it would be the same with Saul. If Saul was going to choose someone to do his eulogy, can you ever imagine David being chosen? And if David was somehow chosen, what would you expect David to say? Something more like what we'd hear in a service, or something more like what was told on the door? You can imagine David saying to the people of Israel, well, you think you know Saul, but let me tell you a few stories about him. And you'd expect David to then unload story after story of mistreatment, much like what we've heard in 1 Samuel. You can imagine David thanking God that the man who's been hunting him finally got what was coming. The man who's been trying to kill David finally got what he deserved. Finally faced the judgment of God for what he'd done against David. That's what we'd expect. But that's not the response that Saul's death receives from David. Because David's response to Saul's death isn't defined by human expectations. It's informed and transformed by what God has said, about his anointed. And David's response to the message of Saul's death starts in verse 11. Verse 11 tells us, "Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they'd fallen by the sword." And we see this response to Saul's death continue in David's song, this song of deep lament, which takes up the second half of this chapter. It's a song which expresses Saul's death as a tragedy. It's devastating that Saul has died. And in this song, David tells of the strength of Saul and Jonathan in verse 22 and 23. He says, "From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions." This is the strength of Saul and Jonathan in life. And then David goes on to tell of the benefits that Saul and Jonathan have brought to Israel. In verse 24, daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. These are the benefits that Saul and Jonathan had brought. And in verse 26, David remembers the love and commitment that Saul's son Jonathan had shown to him. You are very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. And what David's talking about here isn't a sexual relationship. It's a declaration of what Jonathan had done. That even though Jonathan was the heir, when Jonathan could have easily and rightly taken the throne for himself, he was willing to give up that kingly role, willing to hand it over to David for the sake of the nation. That's what Jonathan had done in life. But David's song isn't just a eulogy. It's not just a thanksgiving for their life. It's also a song of lament, expressing deep, heartfelt grief and sorrow. Because with the death of Saul and of Jonathan, all the positives of their life have now ended. As strong and as successful as Saul had been, the repeated line of the song is this: how the mighty have fallen. Now, the big question that we're asking is, why does David respond this way to Saul's death? Like, we might understand his sadness about Jonathan, fair enough. But why does he care so much for Saul? Why does he mourn like this for Saul? Why does he write this song lamenting the loss of Saul? Humanly speaking, David should have been celebrating Saul's death, because Saul's death is good news for him. It's good news because David can now become king. It's good news for the people because Saul was pretty average king. He wasn't leading them well. But David doesn't respond to the message of Saul's death as good news. Why? Because David's response to Saul isn't defined by human expectations. It's informed and transformed by what God has said, what God has said about his anointed. David saw Saul as the man God had anointed and appointed as king over Israel. And in all of David's actions towards Saul, this has always been his perspective. So that even when Saul is dead, David's response isn't good riddance, it's grief. It's how the mighty have fallen. And David wants to make sure that this isn't just a personal perspective. He wants to make sure that Israel's perspective on Saul is the same. In verse 17, before at the start of the song, he orders that the people of Judah must be taught this lament. So that when God's people think of Saul, they think of him as the anointed king. They think how the mighty have fallen. Now, in the context of 1 Samuel, there's also something bigger that David's response points us back to. David's response, especially his song, relates to another song at the start of 1 Samuel, a song that introduces us to God's purposes for his anointed king. The song of Hannah in 1 Samuel 2, which we read a long time ago. Hannah's song sets up this hope for the nation. This sets an expectation about what God was going to do for his people, how God was going to raise up this mighty king before Saul or David were on the scene. And this king was going to deliver his people, reverse their fortunes, raise them up and bring honor to them among the nations. And Hannah's song finishes like this in 1 Samuel 2, verse 10. The Most High will thunder from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. With that song in the background at the start of 1 Samuel, we then fast forward to this song at the start of 2 Samuel, this song about what has happened. And it's a song that glimpses the good in Saul's reign, that reflects in part what God said he would do through his anointed king. but then repeatedly reminds us of Saul's death. That this anointed king, Saul, as impressive as he was, has fallen. He's died. And the hopes that are described in Hannah's song die with him. But what we also see in the context of 1 Samuel is that God had anointed David even before Saul died, which helps us to come back to those original hopes from Hannah's song. Expectations about what God would do for his people through his anointed king. God was going to deliver his people. He was going to reverse their fortunes. He was going to raise them up and honour them. Holding out that hope, even though the mighty have fallen, even though Saul is dead. God will still bring these things about through his anointed king. Now, I'm not sure how long people sung David's lament song for. It hasn't made its way into our song repertoire here at church. But I can imagine that repeated line of the song would have kept being heard, kept being revisited. How the mighty have fallen as each king came and went. How the mighty have fallen as God's people, like David, glimpsed good things in that king's reign. How the mighty have fallen as God's people saw each king reflecting part of what God said he would do. How the mighty have fallen as God's people saw each king die. And how the mighty have fallen even after the death of Jesus. In Luke's gospel, we're told that 2 of Jesus' disciples were walking along the road to Emmaus. Their faces were downcast as they spoke about Jesus. It's what they said. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. For these men, Jesus' death is the same as Saul's death. How the mighty have fallen. But we know, just as those men came to know, that Jesus' death isn't the same as Saul's death. While Jesus' death looked like a tragedy, God showed that it was a triumph. And while after Saul's death, people would say, how the mighty have fallen. After Jesus' death and resurrection, we can say, how the mighty has fallen and risen again. And what God has made known to us about Jesus leads us to some surprising responses. And just one example is when we hear news about the death of a fellow believer, a brother or sister in Christ. We grieve. Of course we grieve. Death is awful. But our response to the death of a believer isn't shaped by human expectations. We grieve with hope. Paul writes about this response in 1 Thessalonians 4. Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again. And so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. This is a great hope, secured by the anointed one, Jesus, our King. Now, in our passage today, we've seen 2 surprising responses. David's surprising response to a messenger, his surprising response to a message about Saul's death, and both responses were surprising because they weren't shaped by human expectations. Both showed how seriously David takes what God has said about Saul, how much David cared about how Saul was treated, how much he cared about even how a dying Saul was treated and was remembered. Because Saul was the Lord's anointed king. And when we hear what God was going to do through his anointed, when we see that fulfilled in Jesus, this leads us, like David, to some surprising responses. Responses that, like David's, aren't defined by human expectations, but are informed and transformed by what God has said about his anointed, by what God has done in Jesus. Now we're going to finish by responding to what we've heard, to what God has done in Jesus by singing. And our song is No Other Name. This is what we'll sing. No other throne endures, no other song remains, but worthy is the Lamb who was for sinners slain. When every knee shall bow and tongue confess, you are Lord, you are Lord. Let's stand, let's sing together.